My name is Camille Rivers, and I'm a 32-year-old executive at one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. On paper, my life is everything I hoped it would be: a corner office at Synergy Tech, a team that respects me, and a product that's actually making a difference. But despite everything I've achieved, I still find myself shrinking a little every time my brother Julian walks into a room. To the outside world, Julian is a genius, the wunderkind who dropped out of MIT to start a company before he was 25. To me, he's the older brother who never stopped treating me like I was a few steps behind. Julian has this way of speaking that makes everything he says sound like a TED Talk. He tosses around jargon, sprinkles in just the right amount of humble bragging, and makes sure everyone knows just how brilliant he is. Whenever we're together, our conversations somehow always circle back to his latest product, his latest funding round, or how he mentors less capable executives, the implication being that people like me fall into that category. I work hard, lead with integrity, and consistently exceed expectations. Yet somehow, my accomplishments seem to fade into the background next to Julian's glossy narrative. It would be easier if our family saw through it, but they don't. Or maybe they choose not to. Every time we gather, our parents marvel at Julian's supposed brilliance. They tell stories about the science fair he won in the 7th grade, or the time he built a drone from scratch in high school. Meanwhile, I get a polite, "That's nice, honey," when I mention a major product launch or a keynote speech I delivered to thousands. I know I shouldn't need validation from them. I know my worth. Or at least I try to. But something about Julian's smugness and the way our family feeds it makes me feel like I'm constantly auditioning for a role I already have. It's not that I want to outshine Julian. I just want to be seen for who I really am. Not in his shadow, but as my own person, with my own light. What I didn't expect was that an unexpected twist in our careers would give me exactly that opportunity, not through confrontation or petty revenge, but through something far more poetic: irony. Because the very company I help lead, the one Julian has always subtly mocked as being too corporate, had just finalized the acquisition of his struggling startup, and I was one of the lead negotiators. I didn't tell anyone in my family, not because I was trying to be sneaky, but because I wanted to savor the moment when truth, for once, didn't need to be shouted. It would come out eventually. Truth has a funny way of doing that. I just had to wait. And the moment came, as moments often do in our family, over a plate of ham and awkward small talk at Easter dinner. Julian, in full performance mode, went on and on about his company, painting a picture of success that made even our dog seem impressed. I stayed quiet, waiting. And then Grandma Florence, in her perfectly timed, casually savage way, dropped the bombshell that changed everything. That was the beginning of the end, or maybe, for me, the beginning of something much more important: being seen. Growing up in the Rivers household was like living on a perpetual stage where Julian always had the spotlight. He was the firstborn, the prodigy, the golden boy. My parents, Howard and Denise, didn't mean to ignore me. At least, that's what I tell myself. But when your sibling is building robots in the garage while you're rehearsing for a school play, it's hard to compete. They weren't cruel, just consistently awestruck by Julian's intellect. At family dinners, it was always the Julian show. He'd dominate the conversation with stories from his startup, funding rounds, or new patents he was filing. I'd try to chime in about a new feature my team was launching, or the leadership award I received, but those moments usually ended with a distracted nod or a polite smile. Julian had this way of steering the conversation back to himself with ease, like a magician directing the spotlight. It wasn't just my parents, extended family, neighbors, even my childhood friends. Everyone seemed mesmerized by Julian's brilliance. I can't count how many times I heard, "You must be so proud of your brother," like my own achievements were merely footnotes to his headline. Eventually, I stopped trying to compete. Instead, I poured everything into my work, hoping that one day my success would speak loud enough to be heard over the noise. Julian didn't make it easy. Even when we were alone, he had this condescending tone, like he was humoring me. He once told me, "You're doing well for someone who chose the corporate route." It wasn't said with malice, just a smugness that grated on every nerve, as if working within a structured system somehow made my accomplishments less legitimate. What hurt most was my parents' blind admiration. They weren't cruel, but they had tunnel vision. They never meant to dismiss me, I know that. But their constant praise of Julian created a vacuum where my achievements disappeared. When I got promoted to VP, they congratulated me over text. When Julian got his first seed funding, they hosted a party. Grandma Florence, though, was different. She saw through Julian's ego, even if she didn't always call him out. She had a quiet way of supporting me, slipping in comments about my strength or leadership when no one else was listening. She never made a big deal out of it, but those words were lifelines. Despite everything, I never stopped loving my family. I just learned to adapt. I became independent, emotionally self-sufficient. I built my career not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself. And maybe, just maybe, I hoped that one day they'd truly see me, not as Julian's sister, but as Camille, someone who had carved her own path in a world that never handed her the spotlight. Little did I know that recognition was just around the corner. It started like any other acquisition: spreadsheets, conference calls, slide decks. Except this one was different. This one was personal. When Synergy Tech began exploring the possibility of acquiring a mid-sized but floundering startup called NovaWave, my heart did a little skip. I recognized the name immediately. NovaWave was Julian's baby. I kept quiet in the early stages, not wanting to cloud the decision-making with personal ties. But as the acquisition talks progressed, it became clear that the company was in deeper trouble than anyone realized. Revenue had plateaued, innovation had stalled, and investors were growing impatient. From a business standpoint, it made perfect sense for Synergy to step in and take over. We had the infrastructure to support their technology and the leadership to steer it in a more productive direction. From a personal standpoint, it felt like fate handing me a moment I never asked for, but might have always wanted. I didn't tell anyone, not Julian, not my parents, not even my closest friends. I didn't want this to become a family drama. I wanted it to stay professional. And honestly, I wasn't doing it to rub anything in. I just wanted to do my job. If anything, I was more cautious, more diplomatic, more meticulous than ever. I reviewed Julian's pitches, his projections, his leadership style. It was eye-opening. Behind the glossy exterior and buzzwords, there were real cracks in the foundation. Julian had vision, yes, but little follow-through. His team respected him, but didn't seem empowered. His innovation was impressive, but it lacked direction. The more I learned, the more I realized that NovaWave hadn't failed because of bad luck. It had failed because of flawed leadership. Still, I didn't gloat. When the deal went through and Synergy officially acquired NovaWave, I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Part of me mourned for Julian's dream, even as another part of me felt quietly vindicated. I had done what was best for my company. I had done it ethically, thoroughly, and successfully. I expected the truth to come out eventually, but I didn't plan how. I figured it would be through a press release or an internal announcement, something subtle. I didn't want to be the one to say it. But of course, families have a way of stumbling upon the truth in the most inconvenient ways. And in our family, inconvenient truths have a way of landing right in the middle of a holiday meal. Easter dinner was a tableau of pastel linens, mismatched china, and the kind of forced cheer that only comes from family tradition. Grandma Florence had baked her signature lemon cake. The kids were running wild in the backyard, and I was doing my usual, smiling, pouring wine, and bracing myself for Julian's arrival. He didn't disappoint. Dressed in an expensive blazer over an untucked designer shirt, Julian sauntered in like he'd just stepped off a magazine cover. Within minutes, he was holding court at the dining table, regaling everyone with tales of board meetings and product launches. According to him, NovaWave was on the cusp of revolutionizing the tech space. No mention of layoffs, revenue drops, or acquisition talks, just a seamless narrative of triumph. I said nothing. I sipped my wine and listened. Julian glanced at me occasionally, usually to make some backhanded remark. Camille's team probably wouldn't understand the kind of agility we operate with in startups, but it's cool to see big companies trying. I smiled. Trying is what gets you to the finish line. He didn't catch the tone. Or maybe he did. Then came Grandma Florence. She cut her ham delicately, dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, and said with impeccable timing, "Camille, dear, how's the integration going with that little startup? What was the name? Nova Wave, wasn't it?" Silence. Julian froze, fork halfway to his mouth. My parents blinked. I looked down, hiding a smile. "Excuse me?" Julian said, clearly thrown off. "Oh, I read about it last week. Synergy Tech acquired NovaWave, didn't they? Quite the story. Camille, weren't you one of the leads on that project?" I nodded slowly. Yes, I was. Julian paled. You could see the gears turning. For once, he had no script, no prepackaged explanation. My father cleared his throat. "You mean NovaWave wasn't doing as well as we thought?" Julian tried to recover, stammering something about strategic pivots and synergistic partnerships. But it was too late. The air had shifted. My family looked at me, really looked, and for the first time, I saw recognition in their eyes. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had done all the talking. After Easter dinner, the house felt quieter. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, like a fog finally lifting to reveal a clearer path. Julian left early, citing a work emergency, though we all knew he just needed an exit. For once, he couldn't maintain the illusion. He couldn't spin a story fast enough to rewrite what Grandma Florence had so effortlessly exposed. I helped clear the table, washed dishes alongside my mother, and for the first time in years, we talked. Really talked. She asked about my role at Synergy, what it was like managing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, how I handled the pressure. There was no judgment, no comparison, just curiosity, respect. My father hovered nearby, unusually quiet. He didn't say much, but when I passed him a dish towel, he simply said, "I had no idea." I gave him a small smile. Now you do. The validation I'd been chasing for years didn't come in loud applause or declarations of pride. It came in the silence that followed honesty. It came in the way their eyes stayed on me longer, the way their questions shifted from polite to engaged. They saw me. As for Julian, we didn't speak for a few weeks. I wasn't avoiding him, and I wasn't reaching out either. I needed space to breathe in this new air. When we finally did talk, it was brief and awkward. He apologized in his own way. "I guess I underestimated what you do." "That makes two of us," I replied. I didn't need him to grovel. I didn't need revenge. I had what I wanted, recognition of the truth. In the weeks that followed, I felt something shift inside me. I walked into meetings taller, spoke with more conviction, stopped downplaying my ideas. Something about that dinner had finally unburdened me. For years, I had carried this invisible weight, always trying to prove something to a family that had already made up its mind. But now, I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I was enough. I always had been. This story, my story, is about more than a family dinner or a long overdue confrontation. It's about the quiet battles so many of us fight every day, in boardrooms, at holiday dinners, and within the confines of our own minds. It's about sibling rivalry and the uneven ways we are sometimes seen, heard, or ignored by the people closest to us. One of the central themes is the complexity of family dynamics, particularly how roles formed in childhood often linger long into adulthood. For years, I played the part of the overlooked sibling, the one who didn't quite measure up to the family's golden child. Even when my career flourished, I found myself minimizing my success to maintain harmony, to avoid challenging the narrative that had long been accepted as truth. The story also explores the gendered challenges women face in male-dominated industries. Julian's condescension wasn't just personal, it was emblematic of a broader cultural issue. The idea that corporate success, especially in tech, is somehow less legitimate or less visionary than the startup hustle is rooted in outdated stereotypes. I had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, not only by my brother, but by society at large, and I know I'm not alone in that experience. Another theme is the journey to self-confidence and self-worth. Recognition from others is powerful, yes, but it's fragile. What really changed everything for me was realizing that my value isn't contingent on anyone else's approval. Not my parents, not Julian's, not even the accolades of my peers. True validation comes from within. Once I stopped chasing it externally, I started living more authentically. There's also the theme of setting boundaries, an essential but often overlooked skill. By choosing not to engage in Julian's narrative, by remaining professional through the acquisition, and by letting the truth speak for itself, I reclaimed my agency. I didn't let myself be baited into drama. I didn't need to. That, in itself, was a powerful boundary. Ultimately, this is a story about the long road to being seen. It's a reminder that even if the spotlight takes time to reach you, your light doesn't dim in the shadows. And when it finally shines your way, you're ready, not because you waited for it, but because you were always enough without it. When I look back at who I was just a year ago, I barely recognize her. That version of me, Camille Rivers, was smart, accomplished, and deeply insecure. I could walk into a room of executives and hold my own, but the second I stepped into my parents' living room, I became the younger sibling again, the understudy in Julian's one-man show. For years, I let my brother's narrative define the way I saw myself. I internalized his dismissiveness, interpreted my family's indifference as truth, and told myself that maybe I wasn't quite enough. But that's the thing about identity. It's not static. It shifts and evolves with experience, reflection, and sometimes confrontation. The events of this story didn't just challenge how others saw me. They forced me to re-examine how I saw myself. In the past, I avoided conflict. I stayed quiet to keep the peace, kept my achievements to myself, and let others talk over me. Somewhere along the way, I had started believing that humility required invisibility. It doesn't. The acquisition of NovaWave and everything that followed cracked open the shell I'd built around myself. I had the rare chance to see behind Julian's curtain, to recognize that his confidence was often bluster, that his success was fragile, propped up by ego and appearances. That realization didn't bring me joy in a petty sense. It brought me freedom. Freedom from comparison, from competition, from the invisible yardstick I had used to measure my worth. My development wasn't about revenge or proving Julian wrong. It was about stepping fully into my own identity, acknowledging my value not just as a professional, but as a person. I stopped qualifying my success, stopped softening my voice. I started speaking with clarity and purpose. At work, I led with more presence. At home, I stopped shrinking. Julian's development, or rather, the exposure of his lack of it, was equally revealing. For so long, he had built his persona around being the smartest guy in the room. But beneath that veneer was a man terrified of failure, desperately clinging to an identity that no longer fit. The confrontation at Easter forced him to face a truth he couldn't spin. It left him rattled and human. In our follow-up conversation, I saw something different in him. Not quite humility, but hesitation. For the first time, he didn't have all the answers. He didn't lead the conversation. And while he didn't offer a grand apology, the shift in his tone was enough to know that something had changed. Whether Julian chooses to grow from that moment is up to him. That's his journey. What matters is that I've taken ownership of mine. I've gone from being the overlooked sibling to the leader I was always becoming. I didn't need a confrontation to get here, but I'm grateful for it. It opened a door I hadn't realized was locked from the inside. Now, when I think about who I am, I don't define myself in relation to my brother or my family. I am Camille Rivers. I am a leader, a strategist, a builder. I am someone who doesn't just succeed, I thrive. And that shift, from comparison to clarity, is the most important development of all. The truth has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it. For me, it emerged over dinner rolls and lemon cake in the quiet aftermath of a family holiday. But its roots ran deep, through years of subtle dismissals, quiet perseverance, and an internal battle for self-worth. What began as a struggle to be seen turned into a journey of self-discovery. In confronting the myth of my brother's infallibility, I unearthed my own quiet power. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand attention. I simply needed to stop dimming my light. This story isn't just about one family or one rivalry. It's about anyone who has ever felt overshadowed, overlooked, or underestimated. It's about the quiet resilience of those who keep showing up, doing the work, and waiting for the moment when truth has its day. I found my voice not by shouting, but by standing firm. I found my confidence not in comparison, but in clarity. And I found my worth not in anyone else's recognition, but in my own. In the end, the most important validation didn't come from my parents, or even from Julian. It came from me. And that, I've realized, is the only kind that truly lasts.